Hamiltonian Freudian field. We're all focused?
Oh, sorry.
This is a fast course version. We're interested in the movement from the symptom to the symptom. And in terms of psychoanalysis, as you all know, thanks God, specialized audience. The field predication, the symbolic, the signifiers, of course, have a gap, and they're covered by symptoms and fantasizing. And we're interested in the point at which there's a defect between the symbolic and the real, and also the imaginary in the real. It constitutes a kind of repair job that needs to be done by a fourth ring. Actually, I had a dream about this night before last, that in order to seal the bargain between the real, the imaginary, and the symbolic, there has to be a fourth ring that in effect allows us to enjoy the signifier. And this is a very enigmatic idea in Lacan. But I think for artists in particular, enjoying the signifier could be kind of what it's all about. That is, we're looking for this realm beyond the symptom and into the symptom, so that enjoyment can be an infusion of the signifier with pleasure. Thanks to a nice essay by a fellow named Young-Jin Park, working in Toronto, University of Toronto, Copjec. He's helped us work through this temporary problem, so I thought it would be something in a workshop setting where, because it's not necessary to be so didactic, and give a little lecturette, that you could use your materials and come up with something much more interesting and speculative. So the primary repression, as you know, comes from the binary signifier, the weak term, get rid of it, cross it out, which creates this problem of what happens to it after that? Where does it get back into the system? Or it turns out all these key questions are linked to it. By going through the examples, or commitment rather, to examples from popular culture, we want to apply an idea of diagramming to this condition, where we look at cathexis in two different modalities. Cathexis as a kind of investment engages drives in an interesting sense. Ed Pluth has a nice riff on this. He points out that the drives, oral, anal, phallic, and then on to the death drive, have to do with a rather common mechanism of back and forth. There's a demand and a response, a call and response. But between every call and response, there's a little gap, a little delay, so that when the child says, "I'm hungry," the mother says, "Okay, here's your food." There's just a little bit of delay that opens up the possibility of subjectivity for desire to attach itself in various interesting ways to other things. So in the beginning, we have a kind of cathexis that is like an investment in a fetish way that allows us to distribute our interest across a field that is like a field of inventory. So in our packet, we have a little inventory field here. Get the field for the field. It's the brown. Is there an extra? Yeah, thank you. And again, everything in this packet is silly. So it's only intended to reveal my absolute ignorance on this subject. Let me introduce my colleagues, Carolina Dyer and Terim, both from the Washington Alexandria Architectural Center. Carolina is a professor there doing her PhD. Darren's doing her PhD. And thank God they are friends of mine. They're they were collaborating last fall with a seminar we did on Metalepsis, in which we hatched this idea to come to this symposium. And I would make a fool of myself while they remain stately, reserved, and tranquil. Okay, so this is the cathexis grid of fetish, which sets up a strategy of inventory. The reason that Notorious is so good is that we get to, let me go back here. Here's the scene. Maybe I can get it to stop for a moment. As you remember from seeing this movie, I'm sure 3 times last week, Alone. Yeah, thank you. Alicia, one of the American spies, her partner Devlin, is a devilishly handsome Cary Grant. They've devised a way to find what's in the cellar. There's something in the cellar, wine, and they don't know what it is, but they think they should get down there and find out. So they have to steal the key from Sebastian, the squad of their Nazi collaborator. Alicia, upstairs in the bedroom, finds the opportunity to slip it off his key ring, hide it in various ways, do a little body loading so that even though Sebastian is hugging her, she gets a chance to drop it on the floor, pick it up on the ground. So we see the moment after that where the key has been kicked away, and this ensues. God willing. Okay. They go down the stairs, that is, some astral body goes down the stairs, but then we see a kind of inventory of the kind of social investment one makes in a dinner party. That is, people dressed up for appearance, they're there to be counted, and even Hitchcock knows that we're using a Texas grid, so he has the tiles on the floor make the point. And it's one of these famous Hitchcock boom shots, crane shots, where the camera does this slow immersion into the detail that we haven't noticed at a distance. But it creates a tension around this spot because the objects have ceased to form their usual things. It's just black and white. But we can see that eventually we're going to end up here. That is Alicia's clenched hand with a key. And it's going to be a ruthless, tight shot. So much so that we can't even figure out how they found the lens to do this. But Hitchcock was notorious for setting up these remarkable structures, these war machines inside cinema. And so at some point, our inventory is going to give way to another kind of logic. Now this is going to be a new use of signifiers, and our argument, idiotic as it may sound, is going to be that this requires another kind of investment. This investment will have not this logic of inventory, but this logic. In effect, we switch from metonymy, pure and simple, to synecdoche, where there's a real center. And as I once heard about bad words in Canadian French, the closer you get to the altar, the worse the word. It's that same logic. Strangely, Hitchcock forgets the name of the key. I think the name is important, it's so unique. He thinks it's like, what's the other famous company? But anyway, he forgets all about it, so maybe he didn't choose this on purpose. But the idea of a unique key and a unique lock is one of those things that frames the scene to come. So just 101, faulty Lacan, I call it, where you find that the binary signifier is, go lower, The binary signifier is what drives us crazy about phenomenologists. They're so happy with binary signifiers. I'm going to unify the good and the bad. I'm going to talk about how nature and people get back together again. It's this promise of a utopian mediator somewhere along the sliding scale between all of these opposed pairs that just drives Lacanians nuts. And it is the thing that distinguishes psychoanalysis from humanities approaches or humanism. That is, instead of mediation, we look for something that's more in keeping with the uncanny. That is, we'll take a binary signifier, instead of looking for middle ground, we'll look for a way in which they cross, infect each other. Sort of the typical definition of the uncanny. There's some terms that we're very familiar with people trying to mediate, but there are also words like sacred, host, guest, fast, words which themselves embody opposite meanings. Now, what this fellow in Toronto says is look for the primordial repression of the weak term. So we're going to find that something is missing, both from primordial repression, but also the formation of a master signifier, which Žižek says somewhere, or maybe several places, that there's sort of trouble in the signifying chain. There's a turbulence, and we need something to calm it. The master signifier is not only the answer, it's going to tranquilize the signifying chain in the same way that ideology comes in at the last minute with a master signifier. So for Germans in the 30s, the Jew is going to be a calming influence because it's going to explain everything. Despite the fact that its logic is completely contradictory, that is, Jews are both wealthy and all-controlling, and then they're poor and Untermensch. Don't look at the man behind the curtain. The master signifier is going to give freedom for this flow of signifiers. It's good to back engineer at this point because the flow of signifiers here can be thought of in relation to something that has created a flow in a kind of Lucretian sense. So everywhere we see a lack of turbulence, we know there's a master signifier here somewhere. Primordial repression is going to lead, however, to a haunting situation. So the return of the repressed, if I agree with the artistic situation, but in normal life, this line would be flat. And these two lines would continue to infinity as parallel lines, and the haunting would just go on forever without any conclusion. But I think it's critical to talk about the work of art as involving a kind of potential confrontation between the repressed and the signifying chain. So we're going to find the Auger Petit DAAP, come back again, and it's going to really make things happen. Now, up to this point, in the symptom, we have a reasonable explanation of a whole lot of stuff that goes on in signifying chains. That is, we know that there's a gap, there are inconsistencies, there are fragments, there are things that don't match. So we're going to have phantasmic constructions, which most people go along with the idea that there's a vertical element here dividing things between alienation on one side. This is a forced choice, you know. You could pick language or speaking, or you could pick being. Not a happy choice. If you pick being, you can be psychotic or pervert. You just have to opt out of networks of symbolic exchange. As for separation, you have to deal with the enigma of the cave boy. I don't know what the other wants of me, but I know it, he or she, big other, wants something. Please, I've lost that letter, tell me what it was. So the symptomatic understanding of things to this point is crying out for another thing, because psychoanalysis can basically handle everything on this page up to this point. But the issue is there another point? Is there something at the symptomatic level that takes us in another dimension that relates more keenly to art, poetry, architecture, whatever? Russell Brigg, I think, said this, that in many ways, Lacan's model of discourse is really like every other communications model, you know, like Shannon and Weaver, for God's sake. It's like somebody trying to communicate with somebody else. In the middle, there's a code. At another level, there's things operating noise and signal and all that stuff. I kind of like this. This is like a challenge that makes you rethink the zones against which Lacan plots his magical carousel of master signifier, objet petit a, and subject, the barred subject. Considering for a moment that the verticality of phantasmic constructions are also the verticality of this, we can sort of see how the forced choice operates in that channel of communication where there's a code required, where there's a necessity to cover up the gaps in things, and that separation, this K-boy ambiguity, operates for these two zones. And I've reduced reduction to techne. Not to say that techne is reductionistic. In fact, the further back you go, the more you find that techne is really the proving ground and related to truth. So, truth, let's just temporarily label that but not all, because as a repressed element, it has to do with the vanishing components of the master signifier, primal repression, and all of that. But here we can see how the symptom works, we can see how fantasy divides itself vertically, how it structures itself around two kinds of vectors, one related to this vector, and another related to the big other. In terms of our frame analysis, we used a kind of metaphor of predication in an expanded sense. We wanted to see how, for instance, you say, well, we use language, but of course, Lacan points out language uses us. So we want to be able to turn the tables at any one point just to see what happened. But in turning the tables, we've noted that there's a gap between the two conditions, and this gap operates vertically in the Mathium for fantasy. We can return to some of Lacan's work on enunciation theory to also associate these two vectors with the act of enunciation and the content of enunciation. That could be helpful. Again, I'm putting these things out facetiously somewhat, but also in hopes that you can use them to play around with your packet. This, I think, now brings us to, let's see, where's our little tool? Yesterday, we introduced the idea of the Xiaosha. The Xiaosha was probably the first computer. And instead of taking things that were unclear and unresolved and making sense out of them, the Xiaosha would take things that made sense and scramble them so you no longer recognize them. It was literally a thinking machine. The thinking was done by the computer operator. Xiaoshas existed, and we know there were important parts of memory systems, such as Raymond Lull, the 11th century Spanish Catalan. And other memory systems where the point was not to remember things as in the typical memory place mnemonic stuff that grew out of the classical world, but to remember things that could be credited to a collective memory. So charges have been around. Daniel Libeskind copied one and used it in his so-called writing machine. So people have been onto this. Okay, here's our little device. And to use it properly, we take the pom-pom of this, detach it, if I may. You may have to give a little tug or grab it right. There's a mirror included with a sticky back. You can take that sticky thing off, secure the end of your pom-pom string, and then place the pom-pom here. Pom-pom.
Pom-pom on the mirror.
Yeah. You can think of it as pure reflectivity. And then this is going to be the signifying chain, symbolically rolling in from out of town, pushing a little pom-pom off the edge of the table. Now you see how crazy you are. The objet petit a pointer is going to go down. It'll refer to that which is outside the signifying chain. That which is forced out